Welcome to episode 3 of the Revolution podcast. Now, you might have noticed from the name and the new logo that we've rebranded the podcast to match Revolution, the annual conference that gathers thought leaders and industry experts within the mobility industry. In terms of the format of the podcast, nothing changes. It just means there'll be more emphasis on Revolution speakers and agenda. We've also decided to create an official schedule for the Revolution podcast, so every other Wednesday there'll be a new episode featuring a revolutionary guest. Enough of the announcements and into the episode we go. Today I'm joined by Colin McKerracher, Head of Advanced Transport at Bloomberg NEF. Colin was also a speaker at Revolution Digital, our newly formed webinar version of the Revolution conference. You can check it out on the Revolution YouTube channel. I think that's enough from me, so into the episode we go. Okay, Colin, thank you so much for joining the podcast. It's really great that you could join us today.
My pleasure. Good to be here, Ryan.
And it would really be good if we could start with you telling us a little bit about yourself and how you kind of ended up in the e-mobility industry.
Yeah, it's actually been a bit of an interesting journey. I started working in sort of clean energy and transport about 15 years ago, originally in the biofuels space, second gen biofuels from cellulosic material. But then shortly after a few years, joined a startup with some friends in Vancouver. I'm from British Columbia in Canada. And there we were developing home energy management tools to give people feedback on energy consumption in real time and also to help them participate in things like demand response programs. So through that, I started to get an understanding much more of the power system and also of sort of the role of demand side flexibility in the power system and the sort of untapped potential there. And worked with a lot of big utilities in North America on their programs, on their smart metering programs and demand response programs through that. That startup is actually still going. It was a company called Nurio, recently acquired by a group called Generac. And then more recently, I moved to the UK almost 10 years ago now and met up with the team at Bloomberg NEF. And they were doing a lot of work at the time on modernizing grid infrastructure, so covering how, particularly in North America and Europe, grid operators and regulators were also sort of pushing to modernize grid infrastructure for various reasons, for things around resiliency or integrating renewables or integrating more demand-side flexibility. So I joined this team at Bloomberg NEF that was looking at these topics. We called it the Energy Smart Technologies team at the time. This is in 2011. And that was a fascinating time. And it was also just a really talented, hardworking group of people that I met through that it made me realize this is a special group of people that I want to be part of. And Bloomberg NEF being a really special company that I wanted to be part of. So I decided to stay in London. And then about 5 years ago, we recognized that there was this really interesting opportunity coming around transport. So that the worlds of power and transport had been separate, but they were starting to come together, the sort of sector coupling through electrification that was on the horizon then. We'd also been tracking battery prices for a long time at that point, back going all the way back to 2010. So around 2015, we started to see those were dropping really quickly. And we said, well, now's the time to really build up a team covering the data analysis and tools that can help people make decisions in rapidly changing areas around the electrification, particularly of transport. So we started building that out about 5 years ago. We built a team around that, specifically around electric vehicles. And then more recently expanded that team to another group that also looks at shared mobility, autonomous driving, and connected cars, because that's one of the big other things that's reshaping the auto market. So that's a team that I run now. We're about a dozen analysts around the world with a bunch of other supporting data researchers and regional analysts contributing as well. And we serve all of the major automakers in the world, the parts suppliers, government setting policy, oil and gas companies, utilities, providing them with a lot of data and analysis on what's going on around the electrification of transport and also around shared mobility and autonomous driving. So it's been a really fun journey. It's been very busy, particularly the last 3 or 4 years as this stuff has rocketed into the public consciousness. But we're always sort of continuing to build and trying to be ahead of the questions that our clients are asking us. And that's a fun place to be.
Yeah, and I think the timing is really special here as well, because you joined the industry at a time when things were changing probably more than they had done previously. And you probably 10 years ago wouldn't have imagined the industry now.
Yeah, definitely. And these things create windows, right? And when we're building a business that is somewhere between a consulting business and a data provision business, it sort of sits between the two. When things are changing rapidly, it just levels the playing field, right? So we were able to go and create what I think is quite a successful practice within Bloomberg NEF, aimed just mostly at the automotive sector, because things were changing so fast, and because a lot of the incumbent data providers or consulting companies don't have the edge they used to have when you're talking about new technologies that come from a very different background. So that's also been fun. There's kind of this part about you're in an industry that's growing quickly and changing quickly, but you're also trying to build a business and build a service and build a team around that and fill in all the jigsaw puzzles in order to do that. And I think I've always really liked that part of it, that kind of entrepreneurial part of it, as well as the fact that I'm biased, but I think objectively this transformation around transportation is probably the most interesting topic in the world right now.
And I know that lithium-ion batteries are a major part of your research, and there's been a staggering 87% drop in prices since 2010. Do you see the cost continuing to plummet, or will we see it level off soon?
No, I think there's still lots of room left to run on this. I think you're going to see prices continue to come down. So one of the things we spend a lot of time doing is looking at not just from a top-down perspective, but from a bottom-up perspective, where battery prices are going. And so starting with the top-down perspective, over the last 10 years, we've kind of concluded that the learning rate, so that's the cost, the price reduction for every cumulative doubling of manufactured volume, is around 18%. And so far, that seems to be holding up pretty well. So every time you double the total volume produced, you get around an 18% price reduction. Now, you don't want to only rely on those top-down approaches, because you can hit some asymptotes and you can get some surprising results in some cases. But generally, learning curves or experience curves and learning rates hold up better than annualized cost reduction. So if you think about people saying, look, they fell 15 to 20% every year for the last few years, that does tend to slow down. So the annualized cost reduction will slow down unless it's growing fast enough that the annualized cost reduction is also doubling cumulative volume, which has to be growing quite quickly indeed. So we generally find that those learning rates based on volume hold up better than annual cost reductions over time. So the annual cost reduction will slow, but the relationship with volume will likely hold. Now there's some circularity there, because of course price drives volume and volume drives price. But there is significant policy that's going to push a lot of volume into the market. That's things like China's NEV credit system. That's things like Europe's fleet-wide CO2 targets. All those sorts of things are going to force a fair amount of volume, which is going to push prices down further in the coming years. We think there's generally a pretty good route to around $100 a kilowatt hour at the pack level, up from down from just over 150 today. Beyond that, you start to need some more significant reductions or significant technology advances to get much below that. So we're tracking a lot of what those can be, whether that's semi-solid state batteries or other technologies in the cathode or anode that can further cut costs. And there is quite a pipeline of those coming. So I think our general view is that the current generation of lithium-ion battery technology gets you to around $100 a kilowatt hour. And that's relatively predictable. You can start to see what those are going to be. You're going to see much higher number of nickel manganese cobalt 811 batteries in the mix. That's already now about 5% of the global EV volume is being met by the latest generation of NMC batteries with a higher energy density. Again, you can see the pathway and the cost reductions that get you to that $100 a kilowatt hour. And then after that, it's going to be harder. The good thing is that, as I said, there's a lot of candidates in the mix, and there's also a lot more volume that's coming. That $100 a kilowatt hour at the pack level already enables you to get fully cost competitive EVs in quite a few segments. Not all. So small cars with a much lower than average purchase price, probably you need to get down to around $80 a kilowatt hour to get fully cost competitive EVs in those segments, which is much harder. But certainly some of the bigger segments or some of the bigger vehicle segments, you can already get there. And it should say as well that you're starting to see more and more automakers talk about profitability of their EVs. So the kind of skeptics in the market have always said, look, no one can make money on these things. We don't see an end to that. And there's some truth to that. It has been difficult in the past, but we're getting to the point now with prices, and that just over $150 a kilowatt hour is a volume weighted average. It's not the lowest price. So there are some groups that are significantly lower than that already. We're starting to get to the point where you can start to make a profit. It's right now for most automakers, it's going to be a little lower than the margins they make on their internal combustion engine vehicles. But it's starting to get close.
Obviously, one kind of thing that stops people buying electric vehicles in the first place is obviously the cost in comparison to traditional cars. Do you think that the lithium-ion batteries are directly related to the cost of the final EV?
I think what you're going to hear more about in the next few years, I think that's fairly well established now, the role of battery prices in it. But I think what you're going to hear more about in the next few years is actually some of the other areas. So one of them is around manufacturing. I think you're going to see a lot more about optimized manufacturing space and time needed to produce an EV. And there you're going to see a growing acknowledgement that you need less space because you have less parts. And also that you can get it off the line probably quite a bit quicker than a traditional internal combustion engine vehicle. And there's some cost reductions there. There's also some cost reductions in how you design other parts of the vehicle. So the battery is on its own trajectory, and that's still the single most important part. But I think you're going to see more cost reductions in other parts as well. Even some of the power electronics and components around that, we're still at the early stage of those scaling up. So there's a lot of room for further cost reductions there. Things like wiring harnesses too, more commonality between systems on those is also going to be part of it. So I say this often. I don't think there's often a perception that we're sort of at the end of the road on how good an EV can be. I don't think that's the case at all. I think we're still in the early going on that. I think things like efficiency is going to improve further. I think the way we produce the vehicles is going to improve further and lead to some further cost reductions. I think basically there's pretty much no aspect of it that I think has reached its logical endpoint. I think there's still a lot of improvement and a lot of room left to run on how good the technology can be.
Yeah, and another big thing in terms of determining whether people choose to buy an EV is subsidies. And I think you've mentioned before that subsidies kind of come in and out, and there isn't really a constant with subsidies. Do you think that this affects consumer behavior and the industry as a whole?
Yeah, subsidies are definitely a big part of what's driven the industry over the last 10 years, right? And generally in markets where there are no direct subsidies, there are also very few EV sales. So, and when you've pulled out those subsidies, sales have usually dropped. They haven't dropped by as much as it sometimes looks like in the data immediately, because when you telegraph to consumers that you are about to pull out the subsidies in 2 or 3 months, of course you pull a bunch of demand forward into those 2 or 3 months, and then it looks like it totally fell off a cliff in the month or date when it gets removed. But some of that is just consumers are smart; they'll behave accordingly to optimize when they can get the subsidy. So there's a bit of a sort of compounding effect in what it looks like in the data. What we can see so far is that you are getting closer to this point of unsubsidized EV sales. So already this year, Tesla sales in the US aren't going to receive any subsidies. GM as well, now not going to receive any subsidies in the US. In China, subsidies have already been cut for anything with range under 250 kilometers. And even the national subsidy in China for longer range, 400 kilometer EVs is still only around $3,600. So what you have to remember is that direct purchase subsidies get really expensive beyond the first 3 or 4 or 5% of buyers. You simply can't subsidize your way all the way to a mass market. So governments realize that, and as different countries hit that level, I think you'll see more subsidies go away. And so this next few years is going to be kind of a bumpy period where some markets surge ahead and then the subsidies get cut and they fall back, and others still have them in place for a bit longer. But the big thing to kind of keep your eye on is the larger policy mechanism. So everyone is understandably quite focused on the subsidies because that's what's driven growth over the last 10 years. But the next 10 years is going to be driven by something quite different. And that's the big policy mechanisms like the fleet-wide CO2 targets in Europe, like China's new energy vehicle credit system and China's fuel economy regulations, and to a slightly lesser extent, the California ZEV mandate. And whatever, if the Trump administration, of course, has just released its revised version of fuel economy standards, which require very little improvement between now and 2025 or 2026 and won't significantly drive large amounts of electrification. But if a Democrat wins the election in November, you'll probably see more stringent fuel economy regulations in the US. The point of all these big mechanisms is that you can't really hit those targets for, say, the fleet-wide CO2 reduction of 37.5% by 2030 in Europe. You can't hit that without a lot of electric or plug-in hybrid vehicles in the mix. So that's really what's forcing most automakers to introduce more EVs, is that they don't want to fall afoul of these rules. They don't want to pay fines. They don't want to have to buy credits from their competitors. And so the subsidies is, of course, important to pay attention to, and it has been the big driver of growth. And the next few years are going to get a bit bumpy. But if you watch these bigger targets, that tells you what's going to happen much more about over the next 10 years.
One thing I really wanted to talk about actually was obviously charging infrastructure and the correlation between charging infrastructure and the rise of EV sales. Fast charging seems to be not just a trendy, but the most efficient way of charging electric vehicles, and almost removes that range anxiety that a lot of people have when considering buying an electric vehicle.
So I think we do need more public fast charging stations than we have today, and we need them to be less fragmented because the consumer experience is still you need multiple cards, or there's very different payment plans and pricing on different networks. So there's a fragmentation issue for sure. So I think we need more of it than we currently have, but probably less than many people expect. Certainly, I see one of the kind of killer apps for electrification in the 2020s is the 2-car family with a driveway, right? If you look at US data, there's over 60 million of those households that have 2 or more cars and access to home charging, access to home charging. That second car goes electric really fast once the economics get a little better, and it doesn't end up relying on the public charging infrastructure very much. A lot of it ends up going, it gets used for a commute on a predictable route, and the other car in the family gets used for the more flexible, varied driving patterns. So there's big segments, I think, that don't rely on the public charging infrastructure very much. Of course, we don't only want EVs to take off in 2 and 3 car families. We want this to be something broad-based and accessible to everyone, particularly as they get cheaper, because otherwise this ends up sort of benefiting wealthy people significantly more than poor people. So you do need more public charging infrastructure. I think you need less than some people expect. I think you do need these big strategic points along all the highways for sure. You need those covered, and you need people confident that they're going to get there and it's going to work and there's going to be ones available. I think the one area that's underappreciated is everyone focuses on really ultra fast charging and this sort of thing. And I do think there's a role for that. But I think workplace charging is something you're going to hear a lot more about in the next little while, because even if you don't have access to a home charger, if you have access to a workplace charger and you can top up and every day at work or a few days a week at work, and you have these vehicles with sort of 350, 400, 450 kilometers of range, then already you're again part of the addressable market without having to use the public charging infrastructure very much. One of the areas that we're watching quite closely is whether some of these other fleet-based applications for electrification, so things like ride-hailing or delivery vans, whether that ends up being the catalyst to build a lot more public fast charging infrastructure. Because in that case, you have sort of semi-guaranteed higher utilization rates. So a delivery van operator knows how many kilometers their fleet's doing, and they could sign agreements that guarantee a certain utilization rate, similar for somebody like Uber or Lyft or Didi, and you're starting to see interesting partnerships there on the ride-hailing side. That can then catalyze the building of public charging infrastructure that I think then gets used by the general public in these sort of top-up scenarios. One other thing we're kind of watching is that it looks more and more right now anyway, like people are using the public fast chargers much more for top-ups than for sort of 0 to 100 or 10% to 90% fill ups. It looks like some of the averages that are coming in terms of kilowatt hours added in a charging session are kind of 10 to 20 kilowatt hours, and in some cases averaging sort of 12, 13, 14. So that is, again, the use case there seems very much to be people are topping up en route to somewhere else where they can plug in, where the car is going to sit and rest for a while. So I think public fast charging and ultra fast charging do have an important role to play, but they're only sort of one part of the ecosystem. And ideally, you want to have charging wherever the car is resting for the majority of the time. And that varies, but certainly workplace charging has a big role to play there.
Okay, yeah, so it seems kind of a cog in a much bigger machine rather than something that alone is going to transform the industry.
Yeah, and I think something else you may see in the coming years too is as the charging network improves, you may, and I think the fragmentation issue is as important as the absolute number of chargers. One of the things you may start to see is that the range of vehicles has been steadily climbing every year. So battery electric vehicles in 2010, the average one launched had a range, or 2010, 2011 had an average range of about 160 kilometers. Vehicles launching this year is 380 kilometers range. And that's going to keep going up. But I don't think it keeps going up forever. I think what you may see is that it actually plateaus a bit as the public charging network gets better, and may even dip a little bit. Or you may end up with kind of a bit of a bifurcation of the market where you have some longer range vehicles that are designed and used as sort of the one car that a family has, and some smaller city cars that are aimed just for urban trips and use the public network as well. But I think how charging infrastructure shapes up will also impact the battery pack size that we see going into vehicles. So I think you may see that start to level off in kind of 2022, 2023 timeframe.
Okay, amazing. Obviously, right now we're in the middle of a pandemic in which we don't really know what our future is going to hold. And obviously, you make a lot of your forecasting and predictions last year, the beginning of this year, and you have certain targets or certain numbers you think the EV market is going to reach. How do you think those numbers are going to be affected?
There's a lot of uncertainty right now, and that makes all of this very difficult. I think the best thing you can do right now is have scenarios, and the scenarios are based around different outcomes from an epidemiological point of view and also from an economic and GDP growth point of view. So we kind of have three scenarios that we're looking at, and right now trying to assign more quantitative values to. They basically correspond to sort of a relatively short, sharp recession and growth returns in Q4 this year, or growth returns, this is GDP growth, I should say, middle of next year, or you're in a much longer, more protracted downturn that lasts 2 years or even more. It's very hard to say which one of those we're heading into right now. If this hadn't happened, we would definitely have been on pace for a record year for EV sales. They plateaued a little bit last year because of the subsidy cuts in China, but they were set to really take off this year in Europe because of the CO2 targets start to bite for automakers, and most of them wanted to avoid paying fines and were ramping up their EV sales, and in some cases delaying EV sales from 2019 so that they would count in 2020. So we were on pace for a record year. I think now we're going to see a drop. How big a drop? It really depends on what happens in North America and Europe in terms of the length of economic downturn we see as a result of this. My sense is that EV adoption rates as a percentage of total sales globally might stay about the same from 2019 to 2020, because the numbers in China, I think, will start to bounce back. Just yesterday, the Chinese government announced that they're going to maintain subsidies for a little bit longer and not cut them this year as planned. The exact subsidy rate's still a little bit uncertain. But so we may see a scenario where total absolute EV sales drop, but the share gets maintained because total vehicle sales are going to drop. That's a bit hard to say right now because it also depends on whether governments relax some of these things that have been driving the EV market forward. So the biggest one to watch is the CO2 targets in Europe. You do see automakers starting to come out and say, look, we should relax these for this year. Others saying, no, we shouldn't. It basically breaks down along the lines of how well they are prepared for it. So automakers like VW and BMW saying, no, we're pretty much ready to meet these. and some of the other ones saying, who haven't invested as much in their electrification plans, saying, no, we need to relax the targets because the industry is going to be very badly hurt by the economic downturn. I don't know how the European Commission is going to take that. We'll have to wait and see. But my sense is we are probably heading for the worst year in auto sales, or the biggest drop in auto sales, maybe ever, certainly in the last decade or two. And the EV market is not going to be immune to that. It is definitely going to be hit. EVs skew towards the higher side of average purchase prices, and that means they are expensive, somewhat discretionary purchases. So we just know, and from past economic downturns, that those do get curtailed. There are some electrification segments that might hold up better. Things like delivery vans, those are being used a lot right now, obviously, and groups like Amazon, I think, are probably going to push ahead with their goals of integrating more of those into the fleet. Electric buses as well, you may see those maintain their growth trajectory because, or at least not be as badly impacted as the passenger vehicle segment because they're bought sort of on longer purchase cycles, longer term agreements. But so it's going to affect different regions and different segments quite differently. BNEF is going to be publishing its updated long-term outlook in the middle of May, and that will include scenarios for the short term as well. So stay tuned for more on that from us next month.
100%. Actually, you kind of just mentioned that now in terms of the short-term impact. Do you think there is any scenario where we could still be seeing the repercussions of this pandemic in 5-10 years' time in the EV market?
I don't think so. My sense is that the impacts on the EV market stay largely constrained to the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
I think the trend towards more EVs is pretty strong. I think a lot of the investments that automakers have made in big new platforms and things like that, some of that is already done. It's already sunk, and I don't think automakers are going to dramatically change their portfolios. What you may see is some of them delaying new vehicle launches. This is not the environment in which you want to be putting out a new high-end vehicle. So I think you may see some delayed model launches, but I think those delays will be 1 or 2 years, not entirely shelving projects. So I think within a few years we return to trend. I think some of these drivers are pretty strong, particularly urban air quality. There may be some kind of link between the severity of the virus impacts, and this is relatively untested, and I don't want to present it as anything approaching fact, but there may be some link between severity or poor air quality and severity of the virus impacts. And so we may see urban air quality. I think we will see urban air quality drivers still remain quite strong in the years ahead. Those are local and are probably much more personal for most people than, say, CO2 is. So I don't think the underlying drivers on a technology or economics point of view have changed. The policy ones, obviously governments have more immediate policy concerns, rightfully so. In a humanitarian crisis, that is the ultimate thing that everyone needs to focus on, and governments should focus their resources on. But when it comes to stimulus and recovery in the next few years, you may start to see some of that directed towards these areas that do have a long-term future. You don't want to be bailing out industries that are going to be not really around in 10 years' time anyway, or at least you want to bail out in a way that's structured towards the future rather than the past. So I think you may start to see some of that come in the next year, and more announcements on that later this year. Already China has hinted that one of the things they may invest in significantly is more public charging infrastructure. We know from past economic downturns that governments look for kind of shovel-ready infrastructure projects as a way to kind of get things moving again. It's probably a little too early to talk about that in most of the world. I think we're still in the acute phase of this while we're recording it here at the beginning of April. But I do think sort of green stimulus will be part of the agenda in places where it's already part of the priorities nationally and say at the EU level as well.
Actually, I only have one more question that I wanted to ask you, and that is actually about the webinar you took part in a couple of days ago, Revolution Digital. I was interested in how your experience in doing an online webinar kind of differs to an in-person conference, which I know you attend fairly regularly.
Yeah, it was fun. I mean, I've done a few of these now, and actually just earlier this year I started, because I was trying to cut down on travel for both sort of time management issues and environmental issues, I started offering to do some conferences digitally anyway. And I had done
Okay.
a couple of them where we had me on video or audio link and showing the slides, and concluded that it could work from that. And then all of a sudden this huge change happened, and then everything went digital. And I think it can really work. I think there's still going to be a place in the future for everybody coming together and physically being in the same place. But I think that might be one of the last areas of the economy that we really restart at the end of this, because putting lots of people in enclosed areas and having them shake hands is probably not the first priority to get restarted. But I do think the digital format can work. I think probably what we see in the long term, and I had a lot of fun at Revolution. It was a great event, and look forward to doing both a physical version of it in the future and maybe more digital versions again. I think what we'll probably see a few years out is not a wholesale switch to online, not a wholesale return to physical events, but kind of a blend of the two. Is that you can have people there, you can have some people following along online, you can have some speakers there, you can have some over video link. I think that's probably the future. The exact mix, maybe it's 70% physical, personal, in physical and in person, and maybe 30% are digital participants and digital speakers. We'll see, but I think we'll end up with a much more sort of mixed world, and that it won't go fully one direction or another. So there'll be a place for both. But I'm looking forward to that as well. I think it can work really well.
Okay, perfect. I'm really glad you enjoyed Revolution Digital. I'm sure there'll be another one in the future. So we finish every podcast with asking if there's anything you're looking forward to in the future, or if there's anything in particular you'd want to plug, something you're working on at the moment, something upcoming.
Yeah, actually, we're working on a big piece right now. We do our annual electric vehicle outlook, long-term electric vehicle outlook every year. Ours comes out in May. This year, we're doing a bunch of new things on it. We've done a lot of work on the economics of fuel cell vehicles and on producing hydrogen, so incorporating those into the forecast. They don't play much of a role in the passenger vehicle segment, but we've been saying for a while that in heavy-duty trucks, they can play a role. Also looking at 2- and 3-wheelers. So we've been doing a lot of work looking at that segment. That's actually the segment that's going electric the fastest. So particularly in China, and then also emerging in markets like Vietnam, Taiwan, India as well. So we're kind of rounding out road transport with that. So that piece is going to come out the middle of May. And then we tour it around and do presentations at different parts of the world for both our clients and other groups as well. But this year it's going to be mostly a digital launch. But there'll be a bunch of webinars from us that people can sign up to about what is happening with COVID-19 and the impacts on the market, but also how does that impact the medium-term outlook, if at all, and then what is the long-term outlook for all of the different segments of road transport across all of these different drivetrain options. So that's what we've got our heads down working on my team. We're all working on very hard on that around the world, and we'll launch that in just over a month.
I look forward to seeing the results of that. Colin, thank you so much for joining today. It was amazing to have you as our third guest, and I hope our listeners learn a lot, especially about data and analytics in the e-mobility industry.
Yeah, Ryan, a real pleasure. Good to speak to you today.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, you too.